I think if we can, I want to kind of aim to do like 9 this year.
To do what, sir?
9 meetups.
That'd be good.
So we'll do like, because every other month is a little not.
Yeah.
It's like every month is a little too much for us. I think. It's small.
Yeah, it's like every 6 weeks or something. Yeah.
If we could plan it, I wish they had release dates for Unity. Because I would love to just do one whenever they release. That's just like chill, like talk about the features. And then do better ones, like more informative ones other times. They don't, you just drop them. They're just like...
Yeah. It's like, oh, we got it.
Yeah.
Let me see what, do you care what version? 2018 dot?
Nope.
Alright, cool. Alright, man. You are set up. Let's turn this guy on.
And then...
Is it plugged in? Good call.
Have you tried turning it off and on again? Oh yeah.
Except this is. Are you alright with showing everything that you're doing on screen?
Yeah. Because I have my notes up here, so I'll just read all of this. Excellent carbon.
Dude, it looks. I can't believe how thin it is.
It's so awesome. The only downside is the graphics. Like it doesn't have. It's got built-in graphics, so it's great.
Oh.
But like, I don't do VR on this one.
That's probably the best. Have you been using breakout boxes or anything? Have you tried that?
Oh no, my brother and another friend. You remember Vinny, right? Vinny De Silva.
Yeah.
He started doing that. I forget. He got a different laptop, but he got one that's like low power, like low GPU. He was using one of the boxes, and he said he liked it.
Oh man, that's awesome.
And my brother was saying the same thing. He's like, it's really nice.
All right.
So maybe I don't know.
Cool.
I'm probably just gonna build a PC though.
Do it the real way, man.
Yeah, because so I have my old PC, and I'll probably just get a new graphics card for that, and then upgrade it eventually. So I don't know if I'll ever get one of those just because of that.
It's more like a work thing.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, I'm sorry, man. My brain is literally blanking today. I don't know what's happening. Oh, no.
Wrong button.
Unity Hub. All right, man. Yeah. You're set. Pretty sure we're live.
File new project.
Yeah.
Are we just making a new one?
Yeah. All right.
And then are we live, like the mic?
Oh yeah. If anybody's listening, we're there. I don't know if anybody's even on. There was one person watching, but that might be me. Yeah, this is big. It's a big delay.
It's so the sensors can come in case anything goes wrong.
All right.
Good. All right, dude. We're swapping over here. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started here. So, I'm Andrew. For any of you that haven't met me, one of the co-organizers, along with Terry, who will be giving the second part of this talk. So, I think what we'll do is dive right in, and then we'll do announcements and talk about some other stuff after the kind of discussion on scriptable objects. So, to kind of give an outline or what I want to talk about, first, just what are scriptable objects? And then second, why do we want to use them? And then for how to use them, I'll give a few links and kind of I'll post those on the Meetup forum or the Meetup discussion after this. So I'll just give a little background on those, and then Terry's going to walk through a couple examples for how to use them. One thing I want to mention early on, one thing that I'm not really going to get into, but I want to talk about at a high level, is serialization in Unity. I feel like it's something that comes up a lot with scriptable objects, and so I kind of want to mention it, and at the end I will also give links for that to kind of dive into that. I feel like when you do things with scriptable objects, you can kind of get into some crazy stuff, and sometimes that leads to errors that are due to serialization. And so I want to kind of give you some links to be aware of that. However, I also kind of want to say on the other side of that, scriptable objects themselves are really simple, really straightforward, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. So I feel like when I first heard about scriptable objects and kind of saw some talks from Unite and things like that, the way people talk about them a lot of times is like, hey, you can build your whole project around these things. And sometimes it can be intimidating to think about like, oh, I have to re-architect or redo this whole thing around these scriptable objects. And for that reason, I kind of didn't pick them up for a while. Like I kept meaning to kind of investigate more. But one thing I really want to do here is just show you how simple they can be and kind of encourage you to take a piece of your project, something that's just some data and maybe a few methods, and just make it a scriptable object and get used to using them. So you can kind of build up that way instead of trying to think about like making a whole project around scriptable objects, which can be a little intimidating. So yeah, so first, what is a scriptable object? There's one thing that's a little, I guess, confusing in the terminology. Sorry, I needed to pop open these windows. Yeah.
Do you want a mouse?
Nah, that's fine. You just have terrible settings, so.
Look at you.
Okay.
Drag the tab. So.
Oh yeah, good call. Thanks.
There you go.
There it is. Except, sure, why not? All right, and then hierarchy. There it goes. Okay, so first thing, let's create C# script. So yeah, while this is spinning up, I'll just kind of give the thing I was about to say. So the terminology is a little weird. Scriptable object is a class in Unity, a built-in class. It is also a thing that you create using that class, and so I'll demonstrate that now to give you a little bit more information. So actually this works out a little bit better because I can show you that to start with, what you might be used to is a script that inherits from mono behavior, and instead we're going to inherit from scriptable object. And so some important things about that. First, these are kind of parallel classes. They both inherit from object, which means in both cases you can access things like game objects and transforms, etc. The difference here is that you have these things like start and update come from mono behavior. So in scriptable object, you cannot use start and update. There are a couple callbacks that scriptable object does have. For example, on enable. So that's how you'll want to initialize things in scriptable objects. But that's not too important just now. So get rid of this, and this is a method. So we're not really going to do too much here, but just to give you an idea of how simple these can be. So going back to Unity, so this is the scriptable object class that will create a scriptable object. Yep. Thanks. That's the one I forgot. Which actually brings me to another thing, which is, so this was added, I don't know, quite a few versions ago. There are also other ways to create these to create scriptable objects in these .asset files. You can create them in memory and do more complicated things with them. I don't want to get into that today. There's a lot more you can do with them, needless to say. But I just want to kind of show you the really basic stuff so you can get started with these. So there we go. So you'll see here now a new float variable, and it'll create this thing. Ignore this XML one, that was a mistake. So yeah, now we have this new thing, and it is a .asset file, and you can create as many of them as you want. So these are instances of the scriptable object class that you've made. And you can fill them with whatever you want.
That's some inventory there.
Yeah, right? So the other notable, or the other like minor notable thing is
That's going to happen because you're making new objects.
oh yeah, I didn't realize that. Okay, I had not gone back to there. So because those are assets, it's going to force you to reload your project in Visual Studio, which is slightly frustrating. I think I saw something.
Not all the time. Maybe it could have been that XML.
Oh, maybe it was that. Yeah. I thought I also saw something on Twitter about one of the guys who works on Visual Studio tools saying like, okay, I'm finally going to work on that. But we'll see. So you can actually, this does take a parameter, and you can name it whatever you want. The cool thing is you can make them, sorry. You can make them arbitrarily deep. So sorry, this keyboard is new to me, and I'm not as fast as I would like to be. So yeah, when you go to create it, then you can have a bunch of, so if you create a whole bunch of different types of scriptable objects, you can put them under a tree, and then if you have a lot of different subtypes, you can kind of do that so that you don't clog up this menu too much, which is really nice. Okay, so the next thing I want to get to is, again, kind of this comparison with mono behaviors. So let's create a new script. And you'll see that just like a mono behavior, we now have that scriptable object class. Ooh, that's ugly. Also, please don't use these variable names. You should use real variable names that are much better than these. Don't follow my example there. So like any mono behavior, you can add it as a component to any game object in your hierarchy. Scriptable objects, that is not the case. So scriptable objects live outside of the hierarchy. They don't live in your scene, which is actually one of the big advantages to them, which I will get to in just a second. What you can do is actually reference them in a mono behavior. So one of the big use cases for scriptable objects is just holding data. And so there are a lot of different ways to do that. And I guess, actually, let me check my notes and make sure I didn't miss anything on like the basics of what they are. Yeah, so, okay. So now I kind of want to move to why you might want to use them and what advantages they have. So like I said, you can store data, and you can also put methods on mono behaviors. They act, or on scriptable objects, they act very similarly to mono behaviors in that way. And so some of the advantages you have, this gets a little bit to the serialization in Unity part, which is whenever you create a class in Unity, Unity serializes that data to get it ready for the editor. So any prefabs, any game objects with all your transforms and all of the mono behaviors that you add, it serializes all that data, puts it together so that it can get it ready to load. With scriptable objects, it's already in the format that Unity expects, so it's a little bit faster that way. It also means if you're storing data in another format, like JSON or even text, you have to parse that before you can bring it in to attach to something. This is a way to kind of get around that, basically. That doesn't mean you should never use those formats. Like there are very good reasons to use them, but if you're using them just to have a data format, preferable to use a scriptable object. One huge thing that's fun about them is they do not reset when you exit play mode. And so they're really great design tools. So if you have an enemy or a set of enemies or something like that, and you want to test their behavior or just their damage or health, you can play with those values while you're in play mode. They won't change when you exit play mode. The other big thing about them, as you can see, they're assets here. So kind of part of that same workflow, you're designing something, you make changes to those, and then it saves out to, or it stays in that asset. It doesn't change when you exit play mode. And then as soon as you're done there, you can check it into source control and send it over to someone else. You have not touched the scene file, which means that when you're working with a team, you don't have to worry about affecting the scene and saying, hey, did you move this? Did you change that? So if the level designer is making changes to the scene, or if you don't have a big team and you're just in a game jam, it's like, you know that you're not affecting the scene, and someone else can be building out the level and you can be messing with the enemies in that same scene instead of making those changes, which is super awesome. The last thing is a little more complicated, but it's something my team's been starting to do, is having multiple different scene files, even for one level. So we have one for that, mostly it's just for the artists to add the new models and things like that. One for our designer who is doing a lot of the UI. So it's in VR, so the UI is part of the scene itself, not just like a screen. And then one that's more for the programmers, that's kind of where the units move around and things like that. And that's very helpful because, again, you don't have that issue with source control where you're kind of messing with each other's changes. The issue that arises when you do that is it can be hard to get references to things across scenes. And so Scriptable Objects helps a lot with that. So you're able to reference something that's outside of the scene, so you just get a reference to that instead of having to worry about, is scene loaded, is this the name of the scene, and traversing the hierarchy. Basically, there's a lot of really bad ways to do it, and I'd highly recommend you do Scriptable Objects instead of trying to do those. I guess one thing I'll note that I saw in a talk, which totally hit home, that I have done a long time ago, is you can do the same thing with prefabs by making a prefab, putting it in your project, adding mono behaviors, and never instantiating that prefab just to hold data and references. Also, really recommend you don't do that. This is just a better way to do that, so that you know what is a prefab and what is just a prefab to be instantiated and put into your game, and what is just data. The last one, again, this is another like higher level, more complicated one. But if you really want to try a new project and try this out, there's a pattern that I definitely used in a big game I made a while ago, which is having manager classes. So you need to figure, something needs to control or have a reference to kind of all the other things in the scene, the things that get instantiated and things like that. And it needs to always exist. But what it ends up happening, and I've heard others say this too, is you end up having multiple managers where it's like your game manager, your scene manager, your enemy manager, I had a pause manager. And so those all have to talk to each other. And when you develop a system like that, you end up having a situation where they all depend on each other. And so when you create a new scene and you're trying to prototype something, you need all of those references, otherwise your game logic doesn't work. And so you get these null reference errors every time you try and do something. And so in order to prototype better, Scriptable Objects make it so that you really don't have to have those manager classes. You can have those lists in the Scriptable Objects, so you can just access them from the scene rather than having a grand manager class that kind of has all of those references. So I think the last thing I want to say about kind of bringing it all together is, so that I kind of built up there in terms of complexity, but if you are someone who has used Unity a lot and has not touched Scriptable Objects, or if you're someone who is not, is kind of newer to Unity, I'd highly recommend just making some Scriptable Objects. Just think about something really small you can make into a Scriptable Object, get used to using them and playing around with them, because they're super powerful, they're really, and they're really simple, like I said, there's just bigger, more complex things you can do with them, and I think sometimes when people talk about them, they kind of get into those. So don't be intimidated because of those things. And then I don't want to get too much into these, but I will post some links about, so there's some Unity Learn topics. Some of them aren't labeled as scriptable objects, but they use scriptable objects in them, so they're good examples if you want to walk through those. And then 2 talks that we both have watched that are just really good about scriptable objects. One is from Richard Fine, who goes by SuperPig on Twitter and on the forums. He works for Unity, has a really good talk, a really funny talk. And then Ryan Hipple from Shell Games, who has a talk about how Shell uses scriptable objects that's also really good, and a little bit higher level, talking about some of that more manager stuff and kind of ways to use scriptable objects across your project. It's really good. All right, you want to switch?
Cool. Yeah. Hi, everybody. We have 4 people watching. That's the most we've ever had watching. So, hooray, everybody.
You have audio this time.
That's right. Because you have audio. That's exactly right. All right. So, just like Andrew said, we'll be... Ooh, sorry, dude. Blowing up your spot. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about examples, but there are a ton of really, really good examples and really, really good use cases that are lengthy and that would take a lot of time to really step through. So I'm going to point you in the direction of some of those. Otherwise, what I more want to cover is how scriptable objects can affect other people in your team. So a lot of these talks focus just on developers and just on programmers, and like that's the main focus. But obviously that's not everybody on the team, no matter what we want to believe. So anybody remember what the shortcut is? There it is. All right. So again, shout outs Ryan Hipple and Richard Fine. Stellar talks, both of them. Highly encouraged, if nothing else, just for good architecture, and they're both just charismatic and good people. Like I said, there's a ton of example patterns, so I'm going to go through a couple of them lightly, show kind of generally how they work, and then I'll probably have a little bit of overlap with what he was talking about. Okay. So who are you guys? So how many of you are just developers? Like all that you do is engineering, primarily? 1. Okay. And how many of you are artists, primarily? Just artists. Okay. And how many are designers? Just designers? And how many people are kind of like indies or hybrids? Like you kind of do everything, touch everything, you're in there. Cool. Cool. Scriptable objects help all of you in ways that you might not expect, because they are meant to not only optimize your code, because they're so lightweight, they don't have a lot of the callbacks that mono behaviors do. So there's not a lot of that overhead if you have like empty update loops or things like that. They also help your workflow incredibly. So our design principles, and again, this is a lot of this stuff is taken almost directly from Ryan Hipple or Richard Fine, so it's kind of aggregating that information for you. So we want things to be modular, so they shouldn't be dependent on each other. We want things to be editable, which means that it's data-driven and it's easy to edit in runtime. So if I'm trying to tweak an enemy's settings, how much of a pain is it if I'm going and I'm playing through my game and then I tweak all of these variables and then I unstop play mode without thinking about it, and then I've lost all of my fine-tuned settings. That's super annoying. So because a scriptable object is an asset, or the instance of it lives as an asset, that means that your changes get saved outside of play mode. And then our last design principle is debuggable. So we want things to be testable in a vacuum. So if I have a prefab for an enemy, this is like what Andrew was talking about. If I have a prefab for an enemy, I don't want to have a ton of managers that come in and need to be in the scene also. I want to just be able to take my prefab for my entity, drop it into the scene, and then it just has references to everything that it needs and it can work. That is one of the biggest strengths of Scriptable Objects. So things we hate. Callback chaos. That's where if you have like 10 update loops on all different scripts and they're all touching different objects and you don't know how to trace them, that's a Richard Fine coined term, and that's terrible. Losing work, like I said, is awful. No inspectors. So that's a big thing because Scriptable Objects tie directly into Unity serialization system. They work really well and are kind of like this idyllic use case for property drawers and the rest of Unity's custom UI, custom inspector UI, which I highly recommend, highly recommend. The 10 minutes that it takes to make a short little button that you can click to do a function is worth it. Things we also hate, no organization. Because Scriptable Objects, when utilizing them on this kind of broad project-wide scale, you're going to have a project that's full of all of these assets, lists of them. So organization is really key because otherwise you might have a Scriptable Object that's an event and it is talking to this, but then somebody else is using a different event and somebody else is using a different event. So it's like, it's very easy to lose track. My first Scriptable object. So this is exactly what Andrew went through. Again, it's super simple. It's part of Unity's core engine. Again, create asset menu gives you this nice little asset, which you can do with any asset that you make. And then it gives you this nice inspector window that will show you your pieces. Okay, so examples and patterns. So I have 3 primary ones, and then we'll see how we get with time, and then we'll go from there and we'll talk about some others. So the most common use case, like Andrew was saying, for Scriptable Objects is as a data container. So because it lives as an asset, that it can act as a table that's referenceable from anywhere. So in this case, and again, this is taken from Ryan Hippel's talk, he has his player prefab, a player HP that just acts as a float variable. So that's it. So all that it's doing is just holding a single float. And then he has all of these systems that can just listen to your object. So why is it better to do it this way versus just having a player prefab with just health on the player prefab, and that's it, right? So first, it abstracts the data. So that's good, right? Because we want things to be data-driven. We want machines that just process our data. Everybody can use the same set. So that's a big one. So if we have an audio system, a health system, an enemy AI system, and a player system, if we're working on a team that has multiple people that are all working on these systems, your root asset is the same. So everybody is using your player HP asset. So the person who is working on the player, whereas if you were using just the player prefab, whoever, you would be constantly be getting these updates, right? Because whoever it is that's working on the player prefab is pushing code changes, or maybe he's renaming things, he's moving around references, he created a new prefab that you didn't know about, so you've been using an old prefab. So by extracting out that data, your UI people can still use your same asset that will be used at runtime, that everybody else will be touching, and all of his systems will work. And it's all testable in his own space, right? All that he needs is his UI asset in the scene. And then he can just touch the asset, the player HP asset in the project to heal his events.
Does it even need to be in the scene, or can it just exist in the project hierarchy?
Does what need to be in the scene?
The scriptable player HP. So
that's the best part, is that it can't exist in the scene. It works. Has anybody used render textures? Render textures, everybody? Yeah. It's that concept applied, where it creates an asset and you're just touching that asset. The instance of your asset doesn't get created in the scene at runtime like a prefab would. it's already instanced as an asset in your hierarchy. Does this make sense? Any other questions about this concept? This was a super, super cool one that I really like, and it kind of confused me at first. Okay, so does everybody know what an enum is? So an enum is a list of things that you're supposed to iterate through. So people use enums for all sorts of types. So it's like if you wanted to do a damage type, you would have a damage type enum that would then contain your types. So it would be like, oh, this is piercing, bludgeoning, slashing, right? Those are the lists of my enums.
I was going to just give some like in terms of, so instead of using switches for like numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, when they're representing a real thing, and especially, I mean, a really good example is like north, south, east, west, something that's finite and kind of fixed. Yeah, those are kind of when you would use an enum for people that haven't seen it. Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Makes it very readable. So I would be like, oh, if my damage type is equal to damage type dot piercing, I could do X, right? Whatever it is. So Richard Fine suggested this as extendable enums. So you can see here, so each one of these is a scriptable object. Now, each one doesn't actually contain any data. There's nothing in them. And so it seems kind of like Project Bloat because you just have this list of stuff. But they're easier to compare. Because you're not referencing directly through the enum, there's no code that you have to touch. So if you're a designer, or if you just don't want to jump back into your code, to create another damage type for me to be able to reference and check on, all I have to do is create another scriptable object, which means less people touching your code, which means less trouble.
So how do you get discoverability of or when new enums are available?
Well, and so that's where the principle of using the Unity inspector. So you still would need a list that contains what your enums are. And there's this kind of idea that what the inspector's for and not making tools that do other things. I think that the inspector should be how you attach things to each other, right? So it's like the inspector is this great tool. So if I'm looking for references, instead of hard coding them very often in my scripts, I'll count on the inspector to do that because that's what it's made for. Like, it's easier to change, it's easier to attach. You can rename assets and they'll retain their things. So you would still need a list of this, and then you would update that list. Or you could just do a resources.load and then grab, you know, everything that's underneath the damage type. So what's super cool about this, and kind of a way to extend this further, is say we're taking this damage types concept. So anytime that we have an attack, it's going to take a damage type, and we're going to pass in this object. If we wanted specific things for each damage type, like say that a particle effect happens, right, with each damage type. In the scriptable object, we define that, right, so that and the scriptable object can have functions, like or methods. It can still have logic in it. It's just that it doesn't have callback loops to Unity's core engine. So if each one of these had an on hit, I would play a particle, right? Then with each of these, you would get a nice inspector where your artist could just drag in your particle and touch your particle and have your prefab and be nice. And then with each one, you would just play your on hit, and it's already attached to what your scriptable object is. There's no lookups, there's no extra dictionaries that you need to do. There's no, dictionaries is a big one, because normally when you have enums that are trying to reference other objects, you get this like weird mismatch where you're like, okay, so I have like 4 things in my enum, so I need 4 entries in my dictionary. Then I'm gonna add something here. Then that means that I need to add something else in my dictionary and then drag something in and then attach everything together. So this just kind of helps skip that step. Super cool. Any questions? And again, just feel free to shout stuff out if you want to get deeper in. So the last one, and this is a live stream talk from Unity that's all about creating UI.
This is one of the ones I'll link to in the stuff I have for afterwards if you want to go through it directly.
for sure. So does anybody remember the old Unity GUI system? This would have been in Unity pre 4.6. Yeah, it was garbage, right? It was terrible. But it had a cool concept, which was GUI skinning. So we're not going to watch this whole video. I just want to show you very briefly what's happening. Okay, so he's got a couple different UI elements that say are spread out throughout your game, right? Then it might be kind of hard to see, but over here he has a list of settings that is a skin, and so he has got 4 colors here. So he's going to change the color. Oh, sorry. So he's going to change the color, and it's going to be applied to all of his buttons. So you can see that all 3 of his buttons are changing color because they're based on that one scriptable object, right? So no matter where they are in the scene, no matter what scene they're in, no matter how they're brought in, they already have a reference to the asset that you do not need to assign because it's already been assigned in the inspector. So what this means is that you can, a UI artist could then just create a new thing, just swap in your skin, and then you already have your same style, your same formatting, your same settings that are all applied universally without having to do it. And the even cooler benefit is being able to change styles. So because it's an asset, it's drag and droppable, right? So if I have one GUI skin for like a certain player, so say I had like multiple players in like a first-person shooter, right, or like a beat-em-up game, and each player had like a different GUI style. Each one of those would just be a different scriptable object that has all of its settings saved, and that applies to all of the GUI that references that specific thing. So it helps keep that data organized and uniform.
What do you have to do to the buttons so that they respond to the changes in the scriptable objects?
They just have a script that's listening for it.
An execute edit mode script?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does everybody get that? So it's just like your code just executes while you're in edit mode to just listen to your scriptable object to update dynamically.
I can see this requiring some discussion with your team to make sure that everybody understands, like, you know, otherwise someone goes in to tweak things thinking as soon as it hits stop, it's going to go revert back.
Right.
No, it's because it's being saved. So.
Totally. And that's definitely the double-edged sword, is that when you're used to that paradigm of going into play mode and you're just like, oh, I'm just going to mess with whatever, and then it'll just revert. Because it's an asset, that won't happen. So it's you know, keeping in that mindset of not losing your work.
Some of the difference in that is that you're editing that asset in the project tab as opposed to the inspector tab. So that's one way of remembering that you're dealing with an asset.
Sure.
The other thing is, that's why you have source control.
Yeah.
You can revert back.
Well, does undo work?
Yes, undo does work with scriptable objects.
Yes.
There are flags that you can set to make it not work if you want that, where it's like your changes are permanent. I don't know. I can't think of specific use cases for it, but the options are there if you want to like have permanence to your objects. The last one, how are we doing on time? Are we all right?
Yeah, it's only 8:05.
Oh man, I thought that was going to take a lot longer. Sorry, everybody. So the last one, I'm actually going to, oh shoot. Do you mind if I open up UFC, JP? Can I open up UFC? Show timeline?
I mean, it's public.
Is that okay? Okay. All right, so everybody know what timeline is? If you don't, you should. You can raise your hand if you don't know. That's okay. I'll totally explain it. Okay, so timeline. Timeline is Unity's system of creating things. Let's hope that this loads. Yeah, has it not been open on this computer for a while?
It's been open on the computer for a very long time.
Gotcha.
So who knows what collaborating.
Cool. So timeline is a way to put sequences of events together in a unified fashion. So before, you could only touch, your animation could only touch objects that existed below your parent, right? So if my animation was on like the top cap of something, I can only touch anything that's underneath. Timeline lets you touch anything that's in your scene you can touch, and it's super customizable and really, really nice. Highly suggest looking into it for any kind of sequencing, any kind of sequencing like cutscenes or things like that.
Repeated movements by NPCs. Especially for like gardening or
yeah.
shooting them in the knee with an arrow.
And there's, again, it's a super popular feature that has a lot of support. I have utilized it quite a bit. No? Is it not a playable director?
Just, or did you put T:?
Uh-huh.
You're looking for the actual
Or my inspector's
timeline.
broken. Yeah.
Hit refresh on this.
Just get rid of that, yeah.
You don't have anything selected, do you?
Oh, I'm looking for hierarchy. Good call, Callum. He's got it. Okay. Canvas. Wait.
Underneath it.
I just thought I just saw
All
it.
the states have their own things.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
We do have one of the lights.
Okay. So this is a timeline. So each track basically touches a different thing. So normally your timeline will touch things that are in your scene. So instance assets, right? So like this is touching my audio source, and it's going to play this audio clip from this time. So when going from the old animation system to the new timeline system, one of the things that you lost was callbacks. So it's like if, say at the end of this VO, something is supposed to happen that I'm not controlling in timeline. Like I want some flag to fire off, or I just want to know, like in code, oh, I've hit this point. So one way to do that is that I could just listen to the timeline time over update and just be like, oh, if I hit this point, fire this event. But that's gross. You don't want to do that, right? You don't want to constantly tick your update. Don't do that. So what we have instead are these callback tracks. And so what this is an event that listens up here. It's an event that when it hits the first frame of this, it's going to hit a scriptable object and tell that scriptable object to fire off a Unity event. So this Unity event,
Just split up the
man, is this?
vector.
Yeah.
So you can just grab the tab,
So bizarre.
and then just move it so that it splits. There you go. Not that one.
Let's do this way, because we don't need a whole lot of down data. Okay, so you can see this is our folder that has a whole list of events. So each one of these events is a scriptable object where all that it contains is a Unity event, right? Because again, a scriptable object can have any type in it. It's just a class. So each one of these has a callback. You can see here. And again, this just acts like a Unity event. But because it's an asset, it can only touch other assets, right? It doesn't have access to your scene data. So it's the same thing where if you have a prefab that you're touching in your project and not in your scene, you can't reference things in your scene, right? So everybody, you got that concept? So on this event, on here, I'm calling the onAttractComplete callback, which is this guy. And so all that this is doing is that when I hit it, my asset delegate will then send out a Unity, or will trigger my Unity event to listen to whatever. So any scripts in the scene that I want to listen to that, I can just drag that event in and listen to it. That also makes it super easy for testing, because say that I'm testing something in a vacuum and I can't be in the scene because somebody else is touching the scene. And I don't just want to duplicate it because that's a pain in the ass. Nobody wants to do that. So I could still reference this callback, and then I make a short little inspector script that says call or click, right? That just fires the event. So I don't need the timeline. I don't need any of that stuff. All that I need is the asset that says click, and then whatever my child behavior is that's listening to the click. And then again, that persists between scenes because it's an asset. It's not scene specific.
And this callback track is a custom playable, right?
Yes, sorry. This callback track is a custom playable. So this is not included with Unity standard stuff. This is something that we wrote.
We're on 2 scripts, right? 2 or 4?
It could be 2. This was written back when Playables API first got announced, and they kind of changed up their working. So it's like writing a new track for the timeline is super easy now. This code, I believe, is up on the Playables talk that we did. That is referenced on the YouTube page that we have, the WOG YouTube page, if you guys want to grab that. And I'll probably release it at some point that's like more efficient and better so that I can actually call things in the scene. Otherwise, that's about it. I mean, you can, ooh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to move here. Your timeline event, is that attached to a particular object, or is it attached to the overall end file, executable, whatever? Or is it, I mean, how does that factor into the full scope of the program?
Like when I build, how does it get attached to things? Like,
well,
where does it live?
Here you said that as soon as it hits that particular point in the timeline,
Mm-hmm.
you know, your audio triggers.
Right.
Is that like saying 5 minutes into the game, this triggers regardless, or is it? What is the event attached to?
I see what you're saying. So, okay, so the timeline works where it's just turned on and it just plays. But any scriptable object event doesn't need to be attached to anything because it lives as an asset. It doesn't live as an in-scene instance.
So is that an indigenous asset?
It just lives in your
project.
project.
Itself, that there's automatically a clock always running that you can always check the time that you're given.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. Well, there is that, yes, but the timeline does not reference that specifically. The timeline, each timeline works on its own timescale and its own, like it triggers that whenever you're ready.
You're defining this timeline also.
Correct.
You're defining this and attaching it to
Correct.
something.
Correct. So the timeline lives on a, what do we do with it?
On that track canvas object.
Yeah. So the timeline lives on these objects that are, basically we treat them like state machines, where as soon as our state hits, we start our timeline going. So it's like when we're in the attract state, we play the attract timeline till it hits completion, or we hit some event that needs something to happen. We found a fair amount of success with that. Any other question about scriptable objects? And again, oh yeah, go ahead.
You guys seen? I think there have been a couple of Unite talks about maybe it was one about singleton scriptable objects.
Yes. So they're in the Richard Fine talk, which is overthrowing the monobehavior tyranny with scriptable objects. Again, great talk. That was in 2016. He gives an instance of replacing a singleton with a scriptable object singleton. So the benefit of that is that if your data persists, and you're reload safe. So if I don't have my singleton existing in my scene, instead of creating a new instance of that script with default values, I'm looking for that scriptable object asset that lives there, right? So that it already retains all of my settings. Ryan Hipple also threw down the gauntlet And he's part of this growing wave of people who say that if you use singletons, that's bad, and that he'll fight anybody on it. Literally says that.
The object exists in the asset, right? And everything, things are all connected in that one asset.
Mm-hmm.
How is it not already like a singleton already?
It kind of is like a singleton for sure, but it's not per scene instanced. So it's like the singleton needs to live in your scene in order to be referenced if it's a monobehavior class.
That's what the whole do not destroy is for.
Right, and that's what do not destroy is for, so that if you want objects to persist, if you want monobehaviors to persist between scenes, right.
So it sounds like what you're saying is a singleton is not a singleton.
Right, singleton's not a singleton. It's not a true singleton because we don't have access to the C++ in the scene loader.
Have you used it in that way as a singleton?
I have not used it as a singleton. It seems like a strong use case. I've been trying to not use singletons in general and just doing things more modularly, but.
You mentioned the idea of being reload safe. It made me think of persistent data, like if you want to save. And then I thought, you could use the scriptable object, something that persists, and through play mode to save your player data.
Absolutely.
So you don't need to worry about writing to or reading from a file or serializing or kind of things. Save my XY, how many trophies I have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great way to do it.
You could save out the variables to an object anywhere, to a text file,
right.
And then read it and then load it back.
Right.
It's all the same.
And Unity's JSON tool, which I know that we've had problems with back there. But Unity's JSON tool is really nice, except if you're doing arrays, you just need to encapsulate them. But Unity's JSON tool works really nicely with scriptable objects, and it's a way to get around moving scriptable objects around easily and saving that data out. And it's literally 3 lines of code where I'm just JSON or my object.toJSON, and then I save that out like a file.write. And then when I'm loading it back in, you just do JSON utility that from object overwrite. You have to overwrite it because the object exists. That's the key. You'll run into that. That caused me a lot of headache. Because I was like, why isn't my object getting any of my settings from my saving? That makes sense.
What's like the life cycle of a scriptable object? You said there's an on-enable?
Yes. So scriptable object has 3 object callbacks. So it has on-enable, on-disable, and on-destroy. So on-enable gets called, obviously, when it first gets either instantiated into the scene, which again will cause a reload. So you can tie into editor scripting that way. On-disable gets called if your object is unloaded for some reason, and on-destroy is when your object gets destroyed. In Richard Fine's talk, he explains that because he's like knows all that deep level stuff. So like Unity is a C++ engine, right? The C layer just lives on top of it. So each object that we create, monobehavior, scriptable object, whatever, has a piece in C++ and a piece in C#. So when we call destroy, that destroys the C++ piece, right? Because we control that, or well, Unity controls that. Whereas C# has its own garbage collection that it ticks and that it runs on its own thing. So when you destroy it, you're just putting it into the queue for the garbage collector to then come and do it. If your scriptable object isn't referenced anywhere in your scene, it will get unloaded. And not that your data doesn't get lost or anything, it's just that that asset is no longer being used. So then it'll free up your memory to be used. And I think that on-disable gets called then. I think on-disable gets called on then. Maybe on-destroy. I don't remember.
So if you destroy it, does it move into the project?
Only if you destroy it in the project. Because whenever you're referencing your scriptable object, you're referencing an instance of that script, right? So if we have, let's go back to Andrew's example. So this float variable script, so this is actually our brain, right? Like this is what each of our scriptable objects does. So when we create a new scriptable object, right, we're kind of creating an instance of this class that's just processed in a different way. It's not actually an instance, but it's processed that way. I don't remember what your question was. I'm sorry.
It's about destroying. Like if I call destroy a reference to the health object, is that the same as hitting the delete key in the project view?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. Yeah, I think it'll just unload it from memory, but it'll still exist in your project. If you do that at build, then it's possible that, or like in build, then it's possible you might not be able to reference that anymore because its address might get lost. I don't know. I'll test that. I'll let you know.
I know you'd at least have to, because it is an asset. I know you'd at least have to use destroy immediate. And I think the one parameter version of that won't work. It'll throw an error saying you have to call it with this extra bool that says like, yes, I really do want to delete an asset. Because like you shouldn't do that probably from the script.
Right. There you go. Any other questions? Again, we'll link a whole bunch of stuff. But if you're really serious about scriptable objects, and you should be because they're great. In case you're not convinced, talk to me after. We'll post the 2 talks from Ryan Hipple and Richard Fine, and then the UI tutorial, and you had a couple others.
Yeah, there's a couple others, and a couple of the other ones are a lot more simple, and so I think they're good if you're just getting started with scriptable objects, just want to see what they're like for that. And then I'll post some stuff about serialization in case you want to get deeper into like what happens if this data gets corrupted, how do I fix that from happening. Again, that's a kind of higher level topic, but if you're running into that kind of thing, it's really good to know that that's probably why you're having issues with your data. Yeah.
That's all I got. Unless you got anything?
So what would be a use case where it would not be a good idea? So given the example of, we're attaching, so we have 10 enemies on the screen, right? We obviously don't want to have a million of these objects laying around for 10 enemies. What would be a use case?
So I think it's not so much. I think the question is more like how much do you want to offload to scriptable objects? Not that like you have to use them, but the default is using mono behaviors. And so using the kind of natural, like that's the thing that is built into Unity. You can do all of this stuff with mono behaviors. You just have that kind of default Unity behavior that whenever you hit stop playing, that your data changes back to whatever it was before and things like that. So it's kind of more about how to use script, like whether you want to use them in that instance, like what stuff do you want to replace, and then like you said, and like Terry has referenced about like they can clutter your project. You can have a lot of those asset files. So I think it's more just about organization and how you track that. So it's like, okay, make sure we're keeping up with those and not just creating them everywhere in the project. So I think it's just kind of about organization there.
I'm more looking at like kind of, depending on the level, say you have an easy, medium, and a hard level, and I'm going to spawn 10 enemies if you're on the hard level, 1 enemy, and so forth. When I go to basically spawn the scriptable object, am I attaching those to the characters, or am I attaching them outside the characters?
You could do both, but it depends on if you want it.
Yeah. So it's like you're not actually spawning the scriptable object. You'd be spawning your prefab, right, for your enemy. So if you're on hard mode, so you'd have like your game controller or whatever, your scene loader that's telling you like, okay, I'm on hard, I want to spawn 5 enemies, 10 enemies. So that would be prefabs that would load that in. But then when they get loaded, they would then look up their data on the scriptable object. And like what Andrew was talking about, I think that it gets a little too cluttered when you're doing individual variables. And I know that some people really like that approach, and it's probably just that I haven't worked with it enough. But to me, that seems like a lot of clutter.
So that I was just typing out to remember what I was gonna like. I think so. There's that question of, do you want just the health for each enemy as its own scriptable object? You might say no. Like that might be too much. What you might want is, like you're saying, your different difficulties. Maybe you keep your settings for your enemies for each difficulty in its own scriptable object. So enemies on easy, or like the count of enemies on easy, right? And so you just keep that data in a scriptable object. So it's kind of how you structure things. But yeah, it's definitely something to consider, is like, do I want all of these assets in your project? Yeah.
To piggyback off of that, I had a class that would represent a player's stats, so their health, their speed, their intelligence, whatever. And I would have separate ones for different difficulties of enemies or bosses. So in my controller, my manager, I have all of those scriptables, and if I see an enemy that's an easy enemy, I give them the easy stats. If it's a boss, I give them the boss stats.
Right.
And that's all living in one place. So it's really, you're controlling 3 scripts or however many scripts to distribute that amongst however many enemies.
Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, a little bit.
As long as you're referencing the scriptable objects in code anyway, like what's the point of putting it in the menu?
What do you mean? Oh, sorry, like this?
Yeah, like what's the point of it actually being in the menu?
Okay, so because your scriptable object, it doesn't exist yet. So this code is what a health container would do, but you don't have any health containers yet. That's why it's kind of like an instance or like an abstract abstract class.
That's what I always think of it as.
Yeah.
Is like that script that is a of type class scriptable object is like an abstract class, because it's telling you what the instances will be like. It's like a class, and then the instances are the assets. That's the.
If you have interfaces that only have data, you can replace them too.
That's another good point. Yeah, that's another instance where interfaces that are just data could be replaced by scriptable objects. That's another pattern, or like it's the same pattern, just a different way to do it. Yeah. See a hand up.
So when it's sitting there in scriptable and it doesn't have the actual physical object, is it sitting there and it's waiting for the object to appear in the game, and once it's been initialized into the game, then it runs the code?
No. So that's where you actually need to use that menu to create one. So there's nothing there. That's just a blueprint for what they can contain. There's no actual scriptable object until you do that. There is, what I was saying very early on is that there are other ways to do that. So you can do it through scripting. You can create scriptable objects, like instance them via script. This is just the most straightforward way to do it as a design, or as a designer, I guess. But yeah, so if you just write that script and put a whole bunch of variables in it, there's literally no way there's nothing there in terms of the game.
So it's like basically a blueprint before you build it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So going back to the example we were talking about with the easy, medium, and hard difficulties, you could have enemy stats that had like their accuracy, their health, or whatever, and that would be your scriptable object. But then you'd instance an easy enemy, medium enemy, hard enemy,
right,
to actually set the data for each of those.
Exactly.
And then that's referenced by all of your easy enemies, all of your hard enemies, all of your based on the game board.
Right. Yep.
All right. Cool.
On that idea, there was also a very cool instance where somebody, the tanks demo? Does anybody remember the tanks demo? It was a simple Unity one. Yeah, it was a simple Unity multiplayer one. Richard Fine takes that and converts all of that into the scriptable objects pipeline. And one of the things that he changes in that is actually the AI for the tanks into a scriptable object, so that your behavior lives in your scriptable object, and it just has callbacks that are just called at specific points. So it's super easy to drag and drop, like, oh, this is my dumb enemy, so I'm just going to give him that brain, and this is like my other one, just going to give him that brain. Anything else? Cal?
So is the only way you can really easily put a new asset in your scene is if you put the create asset menu tag on it?
Yes, I would say it's the only easy way.
Easy way.
I forget the code for it, but there.
If you do it in code, it does add an asset to your project?
Yes. So the reason that it's more annoying in code is that it's like 3 lines. It's basically like create the scriptable object, so create it in memory, and then write, and then you have, I think there's 3 lines, but anyway, then write it out as a .asset file, save it. There might be 2 lines that you have to do to do that.
Can you create it in memory just for the lifetime of?
Yes. Yeah, you can also do that, yeah.
Yes.
For a scriptable object versus just a float variable? Like, is it, I mean, obviously it gives you a bunch more functionality, but
Yeah. I don't know the exact numbers for it, but it definitely has. It doesn't have necessarily like runtime overhead, but definitely has memory overhead because it's just, again, it's more than just like a field, right? Like it's like a class, object class. Cool.
So if there aren't any more questions, I wanted to go over, so there were 2 people reached out to me to see if anybody does
Check the meetup.
oh yeah,
That's right.
If anyone does contract work, there is someone at iStrategy Labs that's looking for someone over the next 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, I think. It's really short term. It sounds like it's a pretty cool project, some kind of an installation. And then if anyone knows any QA testers for mobile apps that could actually QA test for Unity, so like being able to say like this is probably what the issue is, let me know. They reached out to me via Twitter and then the Meetup group, so I can put you in touch with them if you want to do that work or if you know someone that might do that work. And then I guess, does anybody else have any announcements? Yeah.
Next month is Ludum Dare 42.
Oh, nice. Good. Yeah. Do you know what the dates are?
August 10th to 13th.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other announcements?
Not that you'll be able to access it, but I'm actually releasing a game for VR arcades next month.
Oh, nice.
Awesome.
I've been waiting for Springboard VR.
Yeah.
Right now, you have to have Steam. You have to be on Steam for it. And they're adding to be able to host it themselves, so I've just been waiting for that. I'll be releasing it. But if anybody remembers the really, really old Atari game Kaboom, they're like catching bombs, it's a VR version of that.
Nice.
Awesome. That's awesome.
We all get a discount code, right?
But
Yeah.
it'll be at VR arcades. It's not like set up for home use.
Is that like Blackboard arcades or is that different?
No, Springboard is actually one that a lot of the VR arcades are starting to use.
It's like a hub
More.
for all of your VR games.
Is there an arcade around here that uses it?
The Augment arcade that
They use Bible.
that use somebody use Springboard.
Nice.
Yeah, that's the pop-up group. The 3 guys. Yeah. I think they switched to Springboard. Springboard.
We
recently when they
had a
released it.
meetup there, right? Is that the one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With Daniel.
Yeah. Cool. That's awesome. Congrats.
Yeah, it's great.
2018.
2018.2 just got released. Super exciting. If anybody hasn't seen the new nested prefabs workflow, take a look at it. Unity released it, and it seems.
Oh, that's not final, is it?
No, it's still in preview.
So that's the last thing I wanted to do was to go through Unity's announced stuff. not like exhaustive, but just things that I saw that were basically it's unclear whether it's preview or not, or like where it's at, and then things that just seem interesting, things that aren't necessarily in the editor. I'll just go through really quick the things that I was confused about, basically, that I wanted to kind of clarify for people because I took the time, or like was too annoyed, and so looked it up. The job system, they just released the animation jobs, which I'm probably not going to use. It sounds like it's for pretty complicated stuff. The compute jobs already exist. The one that they do not have yet is physics. But I've talked to some people and they've told me that they think jobs is like the compute jobs are good enough to use in production code. And so that one I want to start looking into. I've kind of heard the opposite. Well, and Unity has kind of said the opposite about the ECS system, the entity component system. Basically, they're going to break that API, so don't use that in production. I do think it's something that's probably going to be the way we write code eventually, but I'm kind of holding off on learning it, mostly because I just don't have the time right now, but also just because it's not final, so kind of waiting until they release that as a 1.0 before diving into that. But if you haven't heard about it, the idea for that is it'll be much more performant than their traditional system of game objects and transforms and things like that. I think the code might be a little more complicated to write. Not crazy, but you'll just have to learn a new kind of system for that. But I think it should get you a lot more performance by default, which would be awesome. The other one they talked about was their addressable asset system, which I did not know what that was. And so I watched a little bit of a talk on that it's basically a system that they're using to kind of replace asset bundles. They're also doing what they're calling asset bundles 2.0, so they're rewriting that system, but this is kind of an in-between step. So it's basically to be able to define an ID for an asset that you have so that you can load it either locally or from the cloud. So something I'm not really diving into right now, but I just wanted to make people aware of it because I was just like, ECS, addressable asset system, like I just got confused and I was like, I don't even know what that is. So I looked that up.
There's a talk for that in Unite Berlin through their, just on their Unity channel. You'll be able to see Unite Berlin talks, and that's where they talk about that.
And that's the one I looked at, and they just released more of them today. I think they probably released about half of the talks, judging by the number. So they have some, and the ones they've released so far seem to be mostly the Unity ones. Yeah. So if you're interested in new stuff that Unity is releasing, yeah, look on the page. They are not in their, I don't know if they're in their videos. I think they put them up as unlisted and then turn them on so they don't spam the subscription box on YouTube, but you can find them if you go through their page. I think they have a playlist of all the Berlin ones and they keep adding to it. Another one was Unity Hub, which is the kind of, oh, go ahead, yeah.
What's parking like around here? Are they super like on it if you're doing this late?
I've literally never gotten a ticket, and I almost always get here.
What time does it stop?
It stops at 9. Yeah, I mean, you got 20 minutes. You're probably safe this late.
Okay.
Yeah.
I drove my fiance.
Better be safe.
Better be safe if your tires have been chopped.
That's right.
He's gonna come back. I don't have a fiance.
Unity Hub, so one of the Berlin talks was about Unity Hub, and something they said in there, it sounds like they're trying to release the 1.0 version of that very soon. So I've been using it. I've had a few issues, but I've mostly enjoyed it. Like, it's mostly been a good thing because it's one place to look at your Unity installs, so you don't have to just anyway. So I'm really looking for, hopefully 1.0 will be a little bit more smooth and won't have as many problems. So that should be soon, based on what they were saying from that talk. Another one was Unity Recorder, which they kind of stealth released, which is you can, like, I totally didn't see that, like, just randomly saw that. I was like, this is awesome. So it records your gameplay. You can hook into it from code, so you can like tell it to start recording at a specific point and then stop recording. So like, yeah, I was, yes, okay, good. I'm glad I included this one. Because I was just like, I forget if I saw it on Twitter or where it was, and I was like,
is it only an editor or is it during runtime?
It's both, I think. Because it's awesome. Like, I was like, because they've had assets on the asset store for that, but like
captures all the time.
Yeah. So anyway, that's awesome. They just released it. It's on the asset store. It's free. It's from Unity. It's the legit one.
They're doing a really big push on testing, specifically on making it much easier to test and much more reliable to test. So that's kind of the first wave of their big push.
Hey Andrew, about that recorder, does that only capture screen, or can you like look it into a render texture or something?
I don't know.
Or like a specific camera or something.
Yeah, so I don't know. My initial like thought is that you probably, even if it's not meant to do that, you probably can do something like that, because what I remember seeing about it is that you can access it from code. So you should be able to spin it up, it'll record, so there might be a delay or something, but you should be able, I would think you could do that. The other one I wanted to mention was, along with like jobs and entity component system, I bring this up because I feel like they talk about them together a lot, and I get annoyed by that, which is the burst compiler, which is essentially like, they're writing some stuff on the back end that if you're using jobs and ECS, that it'll be better for your performance, which is awesome, but it's also like, they're not very clear on when that's coming, and it's kind of like, great, it'll be faster. Awesome. So that's another one that I kind of have been ignoring, but it'll be awesome when it gets here. Along those same lines, IL2CPP is something that they've been talking about forever. They just released IL2CPP for Mac and Windows standalone, which means they've released it for almost every platform, which again, judging from another bit of a talk that I saw, was I think they want to use that and get away from .NET, because the .NET compiler holds them back in terms of, with IL2CPP, it's targeted, and they control it. And so it's better for the platforms and things like that. And right now they're supporting both, and so to be able to support just that compiler will be much better for them. And so that's just another good step in that kind of road, because they're almost there in terms of having it all there, which will be, I think, improve their cadence of being able to push that stuff forward. No more Unity script as of 2018.2. You literally can't write it or compile it in 2018.2, which is kind of awesome.
Has anybody been using Unity scripts?
Yeah. I think at this point the big thing about it is if you have any assets that use it, so any of your old scripts or any asset store stuff that you haven't updated in forever that might have a bit of JavaScript in it, they have a transpiler for it, so you can have something that changes it over to C# for you, so it shouldn't be an issue, but just something to be aware of if you update to that and things break. Another big one is the package manager. That's basically how Unity wants to get features to you in the future. So the big thing for that I found was TextMesh Pro. If you're making a new project and you're going to use TextMesh Pro, which you should if you're going to use text, get it from the package manager, because to take it from the old version that you get off the asset store to the package manager, you have to do some work, and it's not worth it. I would highly recommend just jumping into the package manager for that. And then, the other IL2CPP thing that was big was managed debugging on platforms. So basically with IL2CPP, you can debug on your Android or iOS device, which is really good. Unity.math, which is another performance thing. The input system that they've been working on forever and physics upgrade, they both said in a roadmap talk that those were coming in 18.3, which is kind of awesome. So though that was the input one was a little vague. I don't know if it's the whole input system or if they're breaking, because it was specifically in reference to an iOS thing. So just another one of those things that I've been like, oh, when's that coming? Every time it's never here. So something that I've kind of kept an eye on. I think that's most of the big ones.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, in the recent updates, they've mentioned some changes with the rendering pipeline and making it more something. Do you know what that something is?
Yes. So just at a high level, the big thing is the scriptable rendering pipeline. So basically, you're able to script against their rendering, so manage that. The big thing for me for that is I'm not going to I'm not going to do that scripting. I don't know that stuff at this point. But for someone like me that does not do that and is not going to try that yet, is they're going to have templates. They actually already have the templates. So one of them. No, so I haven't used them yet, but I think that's the kind of thing that they're pushing towards, is if you have a mobile project or are working in VR, using the lightweight pipeline, which means it'll be faster. It won't have access to some of the shaders and some of the crazy post-processing effects. You'll still have some of that, but some of the stuff that's really performance heavy, you won't have that. Where the HD pipeline is for that stuff exactly, the really heavy, really good looking stuff. And so being able to have the backend, basically the fact that you tell Unity that, and by tell Unity I mean click the little button that says this is the one I'm using, means that they can include things that either make it way prettier at the cost of performance, or way more performant at the cost of having those shaders and things like that, those textures. Do you know anything more about those, or have you looked into those a little more?
I have not.
Yeah. So that at a high level, that's all I know about them, and that's how I intend to use them.
Did they say anything about when the high-end one might be available for VR? Because it's not like all VR is Google Cardboard.
Well, no,
the Vive on a high-end.
I don't think it's that. I think it's more that even in the Vive, they think most people are going to want to favor the performance over the super high detail stuff.
Yeah, but not having access to it kind of sucks.
Yeah, that's fair. I haven't heard them talk about VR with the high def render pipeline.
I assume that they're just getting rid of deferred rendering.
Oh, that might be it too. I don't know.
That's not AOD or video specific.
No, those are not.
Nope.
No. There was one other. This was actually back in 18.1, but particles, the legacy particle system. Oh no. So it'll be in 2018.3. The legacy particle system is being removed. Again, they have an updater for that. So if you have some legacy particle system that you're using, which you'd have to kind of go out of your way or have a very, very old project to do that. So if you don't know, you probably don't. But they have an updater for that that'll update it to the Shuriken particle system. But just another thing to be aware of in case you aren't.
On a similar vein in like the newer 2018s, I don't know which one exactly, you don't get a lot of the standard assets, so you have to download them from the asset store. Are you guys familiar with the standard assets guide? It comes with all these really cool particle effects like built in. I think it's really nice.
That was another thing that I forgot was they mentioned in the in one of the talks that they're putting all that stuff into the package manager. So they want to move those all over to package manager. I don't know. I think they want to do some. Oh, that's right. They said they want to clean them up. So they want to make them a little. They want to update them for more. They want to update them, make them a little bit better. So like they talked about as like a third-person character one that is in there that they want to like make some changes to. They're almost done with that. They're going to put that in the package manager. So they're putting all of those. You're right that they're still. They said for now, go get them on the asset store if there's something specific you want. But they said their goal is to put them into package manager eventually, so that you can get them piece by piece, so that when you start up a project, you don't have to go looking for all of them. I think that was it. Those were the big ones that I was kind of. Oh, high DPI support on Windows. Yay!
If anybody uses 4K displays.
Yeah. But yeah, those were all the ones I wanted to talk about for the last two.
Any update on their networking roadmap? They kind of put out the network lobby and then left it. Like you try to extend it, it's really hard.
Yeah,
their low-level API is rough to try to extend yourself.
Try look on the YouTube
some
page.
Kind of talk.
Yeah.
Back, I don't remember. I think it was might have been a GDC, I don't know. But they said that they had that in their plans for later this year. But that's all they said.
So I assume Unite this year at LA, they'll probably touch on it somewhere.
Which it's not in the same location as last year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's like down the street, but it's not at Lowe's, which is nice. Or not in Hollywood.
Not in Hollywood.
Anyway, I remember seeing something about that. So there's two talks. There is a talk that is specifically called Roadmap. It's like 40 minutes, so you can skip through. Like it's pretty quick. So, and they have the slides, so it'll be easy to see. I can't remember if I saw it in there or if it was in. Okay.
They just said we have networking things coming next.
Is it the one from Unite Berlin?
Oh no.
So yeah. Look at that one to see, because that one, I think they are getting better, because that one, most of the things they talk about in there are either too far out or they actually give an estimate. So like some of the stuff they were saying is even like 2019.1, which is pretty awesome. The fact that they're like predicting that far ahead. So
it's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those were all the things I wanted to talk about. Mostly that was because I missed last time when 2018.1 came out. So I wanted to talk about the stuff that like. I think the good news is I feel like Unity is releasing a ton of stuff and they're getting faster at that. But I think the bad news is it's tough for them to communicate all of them, and even they tried to put it on the website, but even the roadmap on the website is basically out of date. Like
cluttered.
I tried to look for some stuff on there, and I'm like, oh, that's not on there. Oh, one more was .NET 4.6. So they have the new version of .NET. They're looking to update it, like continually update the version of .NET that you're allowed to target, which means you can get new C# features, which is awesome. one thing they recommend is if you're doing mobile to do .NET Standard instead of .NET 2.0. 2.0 has a whole bunch of features, which is awesome, but then your build size is going to be a lot bigger. So they said probably if you're on mobile, target .NET Standard instead, which is smaller. Yeah. Okay.
Next meetup is Unity 2018 Enhanced FBX Workflows. That's on the 29th of August here. And that is from Unity people are actually coming to speak at it.
FBX workflows.
Yeah.
Enhanced FBX workflows.
So that's one of the features I forgot to talk about because I'm not an artist, but I've seen a bunch of, which is in Maya or Max, whichever one you use, and then I think they're doing Blender now too.
Yeah.
But essentially, you can go back and forth between that and Unity and not have to import. So you basically create it in Maya. If there's something that Maya does better, you can do it in there, and it'll be updated in Unity in real time, and vice versa. If you're doing
it's
something,
touching the same file, right?
Exactly.
You have to open the FBX in Maya from where it's located in Unity. Right?
Yes.
You
But then
attach
if you
it.
change it, it changes, I think, immediately.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Right.
Like I said, I forgot because I'm not an artist.
Do you know if, or maybe I should wait until next talk to ask this question about, like, does it show you more details about what's in an FBX? Because that's what I get really frustrated with, is like having to constantly, I don't have Maya installed, and I'm constantly having to ask the artist, like, what's actually in this file?
Like whether you have animations or materials or stuff like
Like
Yeah.
what are the materials? What are the textures it's using? Like, is it the same
know.
as these other files? And I'm like on the verge of writing my own inspector for it because like I can't tell what's in a file.
I think the answer is no right now, but I did see, I think it might have been the roadmap talk, one of the things they were talking about, and this is not near term, is putting stuff in like that so that the view that you're looking at in Unity reflects whatever you're doing. So something like that, it would be more like Maya. It would have more of those features. And then like when you're doing gameplay in the scene, it looks more like Unity. And then other examples of that. So basically having, tailoring it more to what you're doing. So it has more options that way. So that would probably be then, but I don't know of anything like that yet.
Any last questions? Anybody on YouTube? Any last questions? Sorry we didn't see increasing the font size until now. I did it. Next time we'll check our YouTube live stream more. It is Washington Area Unity User Group channel. I think that's what it is. We posted it in the meetup. We'll post it again.
Also, I was looking at that, and I only see today's video. I don't see any past stuff.
The YouTube videos?
On the YouTube channel, it says upload.
You upload it to my access channel.
No, they were on there before because I found them.
Let me.
Is it because it's going live? That
It's really
list? Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Can you check the channel now?
Yeah, we'll have. I think we'll have to shut it down in order to check it.
Yeah. And then we'll check the last
maybe
meetup
you're right.
and see if that video is still up.
Yeah, it might be because we're live streaming. All right, everybody that's on YouTube, I think we're gonna shut it down. So goodbye, everybody on YouTube. We'll see you August 29th. All right.
Does YouTube do the Twitch thing now?